Thanks for joining us. My name is Gary Wyatt. I'll be one of the hosts. Fridays with a Forester. This is our University of Minnesota Extension program for landowners in Minnesota. And today is Friday, 27 of 2026. Climate-ready trees for windbreaks and silvopastures are our topic today. Host will be myself, Gary Wyatt. I'm Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Extension based on our Mankato Regional Office, and also Lauren Backus, our regional support staff in Andover. Our topic today, again, is climate-ready trees, windbreaks, and silvopastures. Kira Pollack and Anja Gupta, myself, put this together, and Kira will be our lead presenter today. We ask that you put your questions in the Q&A, and all of our recordings are recorded at the Z-link, z.umn.edu/Fridays, and we'll try and keep it to 1 hour. And it might be shorter, it might be a little longer, but we'll try and end at 10 o'clock. So Kira, I'm going to stop sharing my slides here, and I'll let you start.
All right, good morning. As Gary mentioned, my name is Kira Pollack. I'm an extension educator at the University of Minnesota. I am unfortunately wearing a McAllister t-shirt. I had a Minnesota sweatshirt, but I picked the one office in this building that is actually hot. So forgive my loyalty. So, pretty simple outline for today. We're going to talk about the Climate Ready Woodlands program, agroforestry, and then how we combined the two to create recommendation lists for agroforestry professionals. And we'll get into some of those species and then the participatory science projects that go along with them. So the Climate Ready Woodland team created lists tailored to each of our 11 ecoregions, and they detailed vulnerable native trees called refugia and climate ready native trees and understory plants. We are also interested in learning more about what we call near natives, and we have several participatory science projects aimed at informing future lists. So these are models. And though we know that there's no crystal ball that will give us perfect answers, these are at least getting us a little bit closer. They were developed using data primarily from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the USDA Tree Atlas. And then they were refined beyond the what might be here in the future, based on which species were predicted to tolerate our changing climate, benefit wildlife, and maintain health. So thinking about disease and pest concerns that are present or could spread. These lists were primarily formulated for woodland owners or folks interested in planting some backyard trees, but there's even more potential to apply these models to other woodland contexts. So if this project sounds exciting to you, the lists and more can be found on the extension website at z.umn.edu/climate ready or at the QR code. All right, so then what is agroforestry? One of the simplest definitions is that it's the intentional combination of agriculture and working trees to create sustainable farming systems. In agroforestry systems, trees or shrubs and their products are intentionally used within agricultural systems, livestock areas, or forests. Agroforestry systems can be advantageous over conventional agricultural and forest production methods through increased productivity, improved economic benefits, and social outcomes, and the enhanced ecological goods and services provided. Agroforestry practices are used worldwide today. Since these systems are composed of working trees, the species are selected for specific features, such as branch and crown density or their fruit crop. And they may or may not be composed of a specific plant community in the way that ecologists define them. Therefore, practitioners' knowledge, the careful selection of species, and good management of trees and crops are needed to optimize the production and positive effects within the system, and to minimize negative competition effects. Trees are important members of the ecological community simply by existing, and humans have relied on the many services of trees since time immemorial. So we were curious about how agroforestry professionals might think about some of the climate-ready species in their spheres of work. Because of the specific needs within agroforestry systems, there's cultural openness to experimentation. We reached out to agroforestry professionals for their opinions and insight regarding climate-ready native and near-native trees. So we knew there were many paths that this inquiry could take, so we used a method called the Delphi process. Basically, a Delphi is comprised of iterative surveys that start broad and narrow in based on the responses that we received. This allowed us to start asking questions even before we fully knew what questions we wanted to ask. Think of it like going from what could matter to what does matter and maybe a little bit towards what matters most. And we use these to inform practice recommendations. We emailed 3 total surveys of shrub and tree lists incorporating climate-ready species, engaged respondents' interest in and willingness to work with predicted climate-adapted species. After the first 2 rounds of surveys, we presented new lists specific to each of the agroforestry practices. And then we presented the lists to local extension educators, those who work at the county level, who helped us refine them further, including only those species that could easily be purchased in trade in and around Minnesota. This should increase adaptation and survival of planted trees because the climatic differences would be less severe. For example, this picture, urban forestry outreach and research staff member Sonia Tosteson cradles some baby bare root trees that could have been from Iowa, but might have also been from Georgia. And here are some of those spots that we looked through to make sure that we could get the species that we recommended in trade. We focused on windbreaks and silvopasture for the new materials we developed and this presentation because these had the clearest trends within the data. So for a quick review, windbreaks use trees and shrubs along edges of fields to reduce the impact of wind and sometimes snow on crops. This reduces desiccation, erosion, and nutrient leaching. Silvopasture intentionally includes trees within animal grazing or livestock within woods, depending on your bias. These trees could be planted or retained and may be part of a timber harvest plan, fruit or nut production, or just about any other compatible land management plan. So we'll look at the windbreak list first, and don't worry, we will in fact zoom in. So this list includes, whoops, got a little too clicky. This list includes species native to the state, though with a slight asterisk that not all of these species are found all the way across the state. For example, eastern hemlocks ranges around Duluth, so in that respect, it's teetering on the edge of near native. But this list that the practitioners helped us develop was very robust. With a wide selection of species in the deciduous category, we did decide to remove trees belonging to the red oak group. Windbreaks are planted with close spacing, therefore an outbreak of oak wilt would be devastating. The asterisks on this list refer to species that have special planting or sourcing considerations. So red cedar can become weedy in prairie settings. Eastern hemlock is an endangered species in Minnesota and has some legal considerations. And American elm should be sourced with Dutch elm disease resistance in mind. Now, the silvopasture list, which may only be a little bit better just because we have pictures of cows. So this list has some overlap, though you notice that the understory plants differ. And this is because grapevines don't block wind particularly well, but they can feed you and potentially your livestock. And we have some more disclaimers on this list. So you'll see an asterisk by the Missouri gooseberry and the white pine. So the third and then the final one on the left column. And that's because they are both hosts for white pine blister rust and should not be planted by one another. In this list, we did include red oak species, so there is some risk of oak wilt. And some of the species may have negative interactions with livestock, such as wilted maple leaves and horses. But our colleagues said that the dose makes the poison, as with most situations, and well-managed herds and lands are unlikely to have significant ill effects. In addition to climate-ready native trees, we also asked practitioners about near native species that they may want to work with. And I've said this word a couple times, so we're going to define it just to make sure that we are all on the same page. As the name implies, near native species are almost native. Think of them like distantly related family that live one state over. They might move here, but for some reason, probably climate, prefer Wisconsin over Minnesota. Yikes. If you are familiar with assisted migration, this falls into the category of assisted range expansion. We hope that these expanded lists serve as a resource for resilient agroforestry, and we have some caveats that we want to make sure that we enumerate. First, we recommend prioritizing native species, and then experimenting with near natives to promote climate-adapted diversity in agroforestry plantings. Risks include economic loss if plantings fail, reduced ecosystem services if trees fail to establish or thrive, and the possibility of negative impacts on native species by near native species. Remember that agroforestry plantings are not the same as forestry plantings. Planting near natives in forests carries higher risk. When moving trees, there's always the risk of transporting detrimental organisms and disease. Mitigate this by using trusted retailers and knowing if there are any disease or pest outbreaks in the area from which you are sourcing. Another consideration regarding relative proximity is the likelihood of phenological timing. So thinking about when the bud breaks, if that's compatible with when our frost dates are, when trees flower, etc., that lines up with our specific climate. So now that we've given tons of warnings, these trees and shrubs whose current ranges are generally in Iowa and Illinois are for windbreaks, northern pecan, mockernut hickory, osage orange, sycamore, and chinkapin oak. And for silvopasture are northern pecan, mockernut hickory, common persimmon, osage orange, chinkapin oak, and pin oak. Note that pin oak is a red oak species, so there is some risk of oak wilt. And I have seen a couple of these successfully grown in the Twin Cities, which is where I'm based out of, specifically sycamore and pin oak. So you may be aware of these species already, but we wanted to make sure that you're aware of some up-and-comers that have some production value and wildlife value. We have our northern pecan, which I grew up in Georgia, so I can confirm. Beautiful, delicious. Persimmon, also delicious, though I have learned that if you eat the fruit before it is ripe, you will get cotton mouth. It's unpleasant, so you do have to wait until it's a little mushy. Mockernut hickory, also in the south. I feel like I should just point out my tiny little dot of my county in Georgia, but I'm not going to. But you'll notice that these are, generally speaking, if you look at the range map, more in the southern Iowa region. So this is definitely a jump. And then sycamore, which are water-loving species, where I've seen them generally in the Twin Cities is near the Mississippi River. They have a beautiful large canopy. They can be a little bit messy in terms of branch drop, but big canopies. All right, now I'm going to hand it off to Angie.
Super. Thanks, Kira. I was madly typing responses in the Q&A, but I'll stop. So thanks, Kira. Thanks for a great presentation. And this is me again, always talking about eco-anxiety. So bear with me as I do it yet again. I bring this up in all the presentations I do because I think it is real and I think we need to have a culture to talk about it. And it's always great to breathe deeply and take a moment for reflection. So I will remind you of Kira, if you click forward, I think, well, maybe some things are going to appear, maybe not. Yeah, 68% of US adults say that they have at least a little bit of eco-anxiety, and that is a bit old. So I suspect that number has gone up. I also want to just point out that the Mayo Clinic has some research about the value of the images. Water and nature together can be really calming for the human soul. I had a number of preventative care appointments at OMSIC Medical Center yesterday, and in every single room there was a picture of nature and water. It made me so happy. So I just want to remind you, even if you are in a room like Kira's, which is hot, and inside, a picture on the wall can be good for your mental health. All right, if you want to move forward. And so, as always, I want to do this exercise with you. So if I stand, you look at my belly button, super awkward, but I hope you guys can all stand and wiggle if that seems appropriate. Kira and I have been talking for a few minutes, and so let's do a little stretching. We're going to do this exercise together once, and then you'll do it independently once. This is a mental flourishing exercise called box breathing. So breathe in slowly for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now do that again, one time on your own. Awesome. So just take a moment to reflect about how you feel in that super short exercise. And then we can go ahead and move to the next slide. If you want any more information about eco-anxiety, you can point your phone at this QR code, or you can type that in. I bet it'll be dropped in to the chat link here shortly. It goes to a pretty robust website, and you can share this with friends or family or coworkers or anyone you know that might be struggling with this pretty common situation that we don't talk about enough, in my opinion. So for those who were at last week's presentation, some of these slides will look a smidge familiar. And I just want to remind you that as a part of this Climate Ready Woods work broadly, we've been trying to answer some critical questions that folks have around these near native trees particularly. And we are doing that in a number of ways, 3 of which are participatory science. And so we've been doing Tree Tracker, INAT Verifier, and Tree Steward Journal. And I'll spend just a moment talking about each of those. So Tree Tracker and iNat Verifier are both using the iNaturalist platform to look for these near native trees. So this image on the left are all those near native species. And just so you know, there'll be a QR code in a couple of slides in case you want to jump in and see these things. But these species are the ones that were included for agroforestry practitioners and professionals, and when we work together to create those recommendations for silvopasture and windbreaks. And so this is kind of the baseline list for some of those, for those near natives. But there were some really important questions like, can they survive and will they become invasive? And so in order to answer those questions, we realized that a surprising number were already in the landscape. They had somehow been brought in and planted or introduced. And so we could begin to understand their survivability based on if they were here or not and how old they were. And then we could ask folks to look at signs of invasiveness. So are you seeing rapid spread? Are you seeing that critters don't eat them? Sort of common indicators of potential trouble. And so to get that started, we launched this tree tracker project and asked folks to just report to iNaturalist any of these near native species in ecoregions of interest. So, as Kira said, Eastern hemlock is native to the far northeast corner, but it's considered near native in most other places. So like anywhere outside of its native range, we would be interested in it. Similarly, persimmon is very uncommon in the state of Minnesota. So like anywhere we can find it, it would be interesting to help us understand its survivability. So we're now 2 years of data collection under our belt, and we have had a huge number of observations. So if you see this slide here, the image and the image on the right, the number on the left side of that, 9,367 observations, a lot of observations. Now, not all of those are, in those areas of greatest interest, but that's a lot. That's representing 31 species out of, I forget the total number, but it's like 36 or 38. So most of the species and a lot of different observers, that number on the right, over 2,500 observers in iNaturalist and over 567 identifiers. So So really exciting, and the more we can learn from this data, the more we can help inform management. Awesome. And then another project, so that like invasiveness, you can kind of maybe tell that in iNaturalist if there's a lot of distribution and density and you're finding a lot of density in natural areas, so where things have escaped from a planting, for example. We do that in other non-native, in species that are non-native that we're worried about, we look at those things with an iNaturalist. But for this project, we felt like there were some other things we wanted to know. Are people seeing them spread? Are people noticing them being used by wildlife? So are the leaves being eaten, which is actually indicator that they are maybe less likely to become invasive because there's like natural things to keep them in check, which is normal in a healthy ecosystem. And then are people having to do things to make sure they survive? Are they watering them? Are they mulching them? Are they protecting them? That kind of thing. So this was a different like question with different way to collect data. And so we created this tree steward journal, and I just love this beautiful image that was created by one of our volunteers. And so this is a journal, it's a narrative, it's a tell me sentences and paragraphs and send me pictures and beautiful illustrations. And so you can see all the things this person has done. And not all of them are necessarily of great interest to us, but some of them are. And so we've been able to go through and really harvest some really spectacular data out of this data set. And it's not a huge data set yet. We're still, we're still recruiting volunteers, and we have not crunched 2025 data. As you can imagine, going through a journal is really time consuming. You have to code it, you have to sort it, you have to aggregate it. But it's a different type of data that again can help land managers make good decisions moving forward. And so we do have some participant data at least. So we have 32 people that have expressed interest in the Tree Steward Journal in 2020. These are all 2024 data. 10 volunteers actually submitted good quality journals for 11 sites. And I think this is important for agroforestry. So 3 of those were rural woodlands. So that's really great data for forestry, but maybe a little less useful for agroforestry. And then all of the rest, so the other 8 sites were maybe a little bit more akin to an urban forestry setting. So 3 in suburban yards, 2 in urban yards, 2 in rural yards, and 1 in an urban park. So you're getting a kind of a different interaction with the landscape. And then that data was, of course, all collected in April through December of 2024. And you can see on the map the distribution of that data. And so looking for volunteers in Southwest. So if you're interested, please, please, please let us know. But there's a lot of agroforestry that happens in the southern half of the state. And you can see there's pretty good representation of this data, in the southeast section of the state. So still learning a lot, and data is still coming out, but I do think there'll be some applicable lessons to agroforestry. And so here's just an example of some of the data that comes out of this. So I will read these Tree Steward Journal data. These are 2 different journals. So the quote on the right, the quote on the left, it is so absolutely cool to be able to see something grow from a seed into a beautiful tree. I would even enjoy getting them started and giving them away to encourage people to give it a try. I really do believe we can make a difference if we try. And that was from a Yard Tree Steward Journal in Pine River. On the right, I love the pictures, and you can see the tree tubes that are being used to protect this tree from critters. And I love the spring versus later season photo. So this one is just a great example of an eastern redbud that was planted. And then these are the last slides about this. These are 2 other journals, right? So 4 journal in total I'm offering you examples of. I'll read this quote on the left. Even mundane species that are common here but weren't in our woods, like blue beech, ironwood, and hackberry, have been fun to plant and observe. The reward is a combination of intellectual curiosity to learn about new species and pure enjoyment in their beauty. That's from a Woodland Tree Steward Journal in Newport. And then I love the pictures on the right of all of this work to fence, which is a really important thing in many agroforestry systems, right? Particularly silvopasture, where you're looking at putting livestock of some sort with trees. It's pretty common to have to protect those trees as they become established and get tall enough to then coexist well with livestock. And so you can see this landowner is experimenting with different types of fencing. Something that would work for a deer or a rabbit maybe wouldn't work for a cow. And so it is important to sort those things out if we expect trees in general to survive. So as I promised, here is the QR code. If you're interested, I'll give you a moment to point your phones at this, or I suspect it will be dropped in to the chat link here shortly. And so this is where you can find a lot of this this information about participatory science, it's all in our terrestrial invasive and participatory science project sort of category of things, and that changes super regularly, for sure every year, and then commonly once the growing season starts, there'll be phenological updates as things flower and emerge and all kinds of things. So with that, I do think we are ready for questions, and I will actually mute mine and give others a chance to talk. And I'm hoping Lauren and Gary will be facilitating.
Yes. Kira, let's leave your slide set up, please, for now, in case you have to go back and answer some of the questions, please. And thank you, Anna and Emily and Peter, as part of our forestry team, answering some of the questions already. So, as a non-agroforester, what is silvopasture? I think Kira mentioned that, but we've got an excellent website at the U of M Extension. It's extension.umn.edu/agroforestry. I think you can find that. And actually, silvopasture is basically, there's two ways of silvopasture. One way is obviously the traditional way of just releasing livestock into the woodlands, but you've got to manage the three resources: the understory, the trees, and the livestock. So most of our lands in Minnesota are probably undermanaged and not managed well for silvopasture. So you really want to thin your woods. You want to get a little bit of canopy there, but certainly open up the canopy for more grass to grow and understory plants and so forth. And you want to plant native grasses and forbs if you can, although the other cool season grasses and forbs can be planted as well. But most of our silvopasture is under tree woodlands. The other one, that's called subtraction, once you remove or thin woodlands. And then the other one is by addition, like I've done on my personal property. I've added chestnut trees into my open pasture, which my son didn't like when I did that, but he had cattle that was grazing in there, so we had to protect them from the chestnuts. But now I have chestnuts that are burrowing on that open pasture, which is kind of fun. So there's two ways of silvopasture. One, you're managing woodlands that are already established, and then one, you're planting trees in an open pasture setting, and then you're grooming them and managing them for growth in the future, and then managing livestock and understory plants as well. Thank you. Since persimmon is allelopathic, it would be helpful to know which companion or understory plants they have. That's a really good question. I'll let Kira or Angie or even Anna maybe, I think, address a little bit of that. Black walnut is another tree that has a little bit of that allelopathic type of properties on planting shrubs or trees around, or even grasses and forbs around those trees as well that might have problems. So I think you just try and manage the property as best you can. And yeah, I know we do have a fact sheet with the University of Minnesota Extension on what you can plant around black walnut trees, but I'm not sure. Persimmons is new to us in Minnesota, so that's a new particular plant. Anna, do you want to speak to that?
No, I agree with you, Gary. I'm much less familiar with persimmon compared to black walnut, and even that I'm not familiar with because it doesn't really grow up here in northern Minnesota. But with persimmon, and to account for the fact that it's allelopathic, I would just I think the original question was asking, what are the risks of planting persimmon right next to a timber stand? And, it's important to recognize that persimmon has a lot of benefits, whether it's the fruit or, the filling in the context here for agroforestry, or has really valuable wood. But just consider, what are your goals for that timber stand versus where you're planting persimmon? And then consider how you're spacing that persimmon in relationship to that timber stand, if regeneration of tree seedlings and understory plants is a high priority. And I'm also not exactly sure how severe the impact of that persimmon allelopathy is in terms of regeneration on tree seedlings and understory plants. Maybe others here know more than I do, but I don't know how significantly it reduces regeneration.
So I'd like to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I saw that question come through, and I was trying to find what it was in reference to, and couldn't find. I couldn't find that. So if you have a good well-cited source for the allelopathic properties of persimmon, please send that to us. And then I want to dispel the allelopathic properties of black walnut. So black walnut is commonly considered an allelopathic species, but one of our colleagues a few years ago decided to do a deep dive in that because it wasn't actually driving what many of us were seeing and experiencing in the woods. There's plenty of native plants that grow under black walnuts. And so our colleague did a deep dive, and what he realized was the research was spinning, and it like our extension was linking to someone else's extension, was linking to someone else's extension. But when you went back to the actual primary research, the only scientific evidence to support the allelopathic properties of walnut were in greenhouse settings. And once those trees moved out of the greenhouse, they actually couldn't find and reproduce research that they were allelopathic. So I share this now. So if you look closely at University of Minnesota Extension website, we've actually taken down those references. I will share, we have not done the extra step to try to get our colleagues across the nation to take that down, so that that information sort of persists in the cycle of online content, and it just spins and spins and spins. But when I share this with people, they're always like, but my tomatoes grow terribly under my walnut. And I would remind you that a walnut is a very large mature tree with a very dense canopy. And it turns out many things do poorly under those conditions. And so none of that is really to address your persimmon, but I would love if you have a good citation for that to please send it to us, and we'll be sure to update our information.
And this
Thanks,
would
Amy.
be a great opportunity to rely on the extension websites of our neighboring states. With the exception of the juglone allelopathy, generally speaking, our jobs are to produce research-backed information, and that is what we do really well. So since persimmon isn't really in Minnesota, we don't have that information, but Iowa Extension should, for example.
Great. Thanks, Kira and Angie and Anna. So next question. Oh, and some of the people are saying that they can't get some of the codes, QR codes, correctly. Email Angie or Kira or myself or Angie or Anna on the screen, and we'll get those codes to you. So the next question, do you have any information on relative fire tolerance of some of these trees? Mostly interested in the silvopasture list, and look for species besides white oaks that can tolerate frequent and low severity of fire. I don't think we looked at that, Ben. So yeah, we probably don't have a list of fire tolerant species necessarily. That's a good idea that we'll have to look at that. Thank you for that question. Thoughts on subtraction in deciduous stands along with dealing with stumps left behind? Well, I can answer that maybe too. If you're thinning and stump left behind, that's just one of the problems of thinning, I guess. And maybe Anna has more of a issue to talk about that. But stumps left behind, certainly you probably on silvopasture situation, you're probably not going to rogue them out. But yeah, she may have a comment on managing forests.
Yeah, I agree with you, Gary. And on the forestry side, unless the stumps are going to be causing operational issues, I think it's totally fine to leave them behind because those stumps are going to decay and provide wildlife habitat, provide habitat for fungi and other organisms, and eventually it will decompose, and that's good for the soil. And so I think it's fine to leave those stumps behind if we're thinking in a forestry context. And it's also a lot of work to remove them, like Gary said.
Right. Yeah,
and I want to jump in and add to that a little bit. So if you're reducing your deciduous canopy in a forested stand for forestry reasons, so think for like tree production or health reasons, to be frank, I don't think the silvopasture is the information that you want. So know that there's another group of people working on recommendations related to forestry, and those are not out yet. So if you were going to put livestock in, and you're worried about taking deciduous trees out for livestock purposes, then it would fall under silvopasture. I don't know that you commonly take deciduous trees out of windbreaks, so that I don't think this question applies to that. So just recognize that today we're talking about So agroforestry and the recommendations there are different than forestry recommendations when you're managing for timber quality or species composition or wildlife in forests.
Good. Thank you, Angie and Anna. Also, there are DNR foresters in each state, certainly, that you can reach out to for managing your forest. And if you're not releasing livestock in your forest, then it's not a silvopasture, but you want to manage your forest correctly. And certainly that's a great resource is contact your local DNR forester. So what are the geographic distance and ecological factors that determine whether a species is identified as near native versus non-native?
I'll take that one. So as an invasive species specialist, I would say that is not something that the field in either invasive species or forestry has really clearly defined, in my opinion, right? So when we talk about invasive species, they are non-native species that cause economic, ecological, or human health harm. But the question is then, what is native? And so it's the same with what is near native. And so I have done a number of deep dives into a good definition for native, and truthfully, hard to find one. So it's interesting that we use non-native and there seems to be some level of acceptance what that means, but the core to that is this term native, and there isn't broad acceptance on what that means. We added, for the first time, if you notice, the range maps for many of those near natives today, in part to kind of show you what we were talking about. Because if you look closely at what is native, you get really different answers. So in my opinion, the DNR has the most restricted native range, and the Minnesota DNR has the most restricted native range. For example, if you look at black walnut, it's only like the southern third of Minnesota is counted as native black walnut range. Now, if you look at the US Forest Service native data, it goes further north and a little bit further west. If you look at the iNaturalist distribution data, which is not the same, it goes much further northeast and north in general. And so what is native is a super great question. I like to think of it as the ecological limitations for a species. So for example, when I think of invasive, I do really think about, could it have moved here on its own? Does it have critters that could keep it in check in that transition? And what we commonly find are major barriers to natural movement are the Great Plains, the Atlantic Ocean, the poles, and sort of major climate differences if you were to try to go to South America, right? You'd have to often, I mean, birds migrate from South America all the time, but overland critters like plants would need to come through the Southwest, and that's functionally impossible for most of our plants, right? So when you move something from Europe or Asia and you bring it here, it doesn't commonly come with any of those ecological services. That's when you see species become a problem. So I'm not going to dive into it, but I have a lot of opinions about black walnut black locust as being considered invasive, because that's one of those species where it is native to much of the eastern United States. It's native to some forests that have some similar compositions to ours. It's aggressive on prairies. People don't like it. And so it is classified as an invasive under the Minnesota noxious weed law. But I think it's a good example of where that conversation kind of breaks down. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but I talked for a long time and hopefully gave some reasonable context.
Here, can you move back your slides back to the windbreak section and show those, please? We had a comment on the questions there. And Anna, did you have your hand up? Did you want to make a comment?
No, Angie said everything that I wanted to say.
Okay, great. So another question on black walnut allelopathic. Let's see, can any of the allelopathic that people experience with black walnut be caused by the walnuts themselves dropping since they are so heavy in tannins?
I can jump in here since I brought this whole quagmire up, and I would argue I don't know that we know the answer. So, sure. I mean, the allelopathic properties of essentially roots was what was being studied, in my understanding, from those original articles in the greenhouses. And they did notice observations of reduced growth in adjacent plants in the greenhouse, but they couldn't mimic that in the forest. So, I mean, just straight up, those weren't producing walnuts, right? I mean, those were small seedlings. It's possible. My experience with walnuts in the woods is that the walnuts don't stay below those trees. I mean, I have some very industrious squirrels in my woodland that I do a lot of work on, and they move those to their nests lickety split fast. And so I don't want to underestimate what might be happening in that transition, but I don't know.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question on northern pecan. Are there northern pecan in Minnesota now? I'll start with that answer and then leave it to my forestry team. Actually, I was in Farm Fest, which is Redwood Falls, Minnesota, southwestern Minnesota. And one of our farmers came up to the University of Minnesota Extension tent and said he has planted northern pecan. I'm not sure. I don't think he's got any bearing yet or producing pecans yet, but he has planted some. So certainly, yeah, there's some planted. I know we have actually a person in southeastern Minnesota, a farmer that took land out of production and planted 1,200 chestnut trees. So we have some really forward-thinking producers out there that are trying different trees out there. So anybody else on the forestry team, do you know of any northern pecan planted in Minnesota yet?
Yes, and I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to take over. So I think I can do that. I don't think Kira has to stop.
Okay.
I'm hopeful you can see. I think you can. This is our Tree Tracker iNaturalist project. And so to answer such a great question, we were able to ask people to look for this species, and there have been 6 observations reported. So I can click on those and I can see where they are in the state. And these appear to be all, there is one way down in southeast or southwest rather. So if you're not familiar with how iNaturalist works, so these are the reports that have come into our project. Our project scoops up all of the species within the state, and then it just displays that information for me in this way. For anyone, you all can look at it, and you can see. Oh, I did this. Is this at Gary's house?
It might be at my place. You're right.
We had a field tour. I did a lot of iNatting.
I have planted some, but not producing yet. So
yeah, and so here we go. This is Gary's house, and then there are several others. That's just kind of funny. Okay, and I'll just show you another one so you can see. And both of these, it's interesting that you can see both trees were protected. This is an individual report, and so we don't know how this will survive, right? A gift from a Master Naturalist Conference in 2025. This might have been extension yet again. So great question. I will stop sharing. And so the short answer is yes, we know of 6.
Thank you, Angie, for sharing that. That's pretty funny. What preparation must be done for invasive plants when thinning a forest to turn over to silvopasture?
I can take that again.
Okay.
So it depends on the type of invasive plant, and all invasive plants need to be managed differently depending upon the plant and the situation. If you're talking buckthorn, for example, you would, depending on the size of buckthorn, probably, I mean, you could be looking at cutting and stump treating. You could be looking like at a forestry mower situation if it's smaller diameter. If you had goats, which could work in an agroforestry setting, or forestry mowing, recognize those do not have herbicide treatments to them. So you're going to look at multiple years of treatment, probably 3 to 4, to get good killback rates. If you're looking at larger trees, you're going to maybe be able to take those out and treat them, but recognize there is likely a very robust seed source underneath those that will germinate for 2 to 3 years. And so you're going to have to figure out how to manage that seed source. So you can hand pull, it's thousands per small area, but you can put goats in, you can do a number of things. In some settings, grasses can be a real issue, so you might need herbicide or repeat mowing. There's some great examples of that pre-work to get trees established in those like crossover areas in the Great Lakes Silvicultural Library. So I will stop talking and drop in 2 links. One, invasive plant control database, which has really great information about invasive plant species by species, your level of expertise and the season, and then it offers you lots of choices, chemical and non-chemical, how to manage those plants. And then I will drop in a link to the Great Lakes Silvicultural Library, which you can dive into that, and you can look for a situation that might be helpful in a situation for another example of a situation that could be helpful for you in your situation.
Thank you.
I did want to add that thinking of that pre-work, so one of the perspectives that I have is maybe you are thinning for the purpose of establishing silvopasture, and it's not that you have invasive species, but that disturbance could bring them in. So thinking about how you can seed that area so that you're kind of preempting. You're not allowing any invasives to come in because you're already establishing native plants.
Great.
A good resource for that would be the Covered Up project through the U of M. I don't know what that one means.
Very good, Kara. Yeah, Covered Up is a Buckthorn Covered Up program. That's a very good website there. I think do a Google search on that. Another question is, I think Angie too. Also, a native also need to know a native to when, as natives to the land as it was 100 years ago or now. I've got a interesting little side segment on that. A science teacher from St. James, where I live, went up with a science group from his high school, and they brought back a fossil. And the fossil rock, believe it or not, had a ginkgo leaf on it, on the fossil. So there you go. So my talk about ginkgo trees being native to Minnesota, maybe a couple thousand years ago, maybe, whatever. I'll leave that to some of the other guys too.
Yeah, I can jump into this. Yeah, it absolutely matters. And that's one of my beefs with the native plant maps, to be really frank, is almost always they are considered native to the first European people that bothered to take inventory. And I would point out that by the time those first European peoples that bothered to take inventory, so think 1850s to 1900-ish, there had already been very significant declines in indigenous populations from disease and continued warfare. Indigenous communities in Minnesota and throughout the United States were very active land managers in ways that many Europeans could not see or understand, using fire as a very powerful tool in order to activate grazing land for deer, for bison, for elk, for buffalo, all kinds of things. They also moved across the landscape. So in the winter, it was very common that our northern tribes would overwinter, have their winter camps in conifer stands because there was a lot more protection and thermal heat. In the spring, they would move to like sugar bushes where they could harvest that really valuable sugar resource from the maple trees. Maple trees are generally fire intolerant, so they probably were not managing those stands with fire. Then in the summer, they would move to the recently flooded lowland valleys of river plains where they could farm in some ways that Europeans might recognize on those recently flooded and thus very rich um, floodplain sites. And then in the fall, they would migrate to hunting areas where they could harvest both acorns for their winter storage and for all kinds of proteins. So think your deer, your elk, your bison, that kind of thing. So they were moving across the landscape and using it. And while they moved, they very, very commonly brought seeds of valuable plants, and they used almost all of the plants. I have a gigantic book about ethnobotany, and I've never once looked a plant up and not found that plant in that book. So I think they were using just about everything in some way, shape, or form. And so when those populations declined, so those indigenous populations declined, presumably the plants that they had been very actively managing also shifted and changed. So when those first Europeans who bothered to take account showed up, the ecosystem was probably not at all like it had been for many thousands of years before that. So it does beg a number of questions about why we use that as our baseline for normalcy when there's probably pretty significant data that it was anything but normal. So to your point, when do we pick? And so unlike Gary, I do have an opinion about ginkgo trees being native to Minnesota. And I like to think of like when the glaciers last receded. So that was like a reset point for Minnesota's forests. And ever since the glaciers last receded in Minnesota, there have been humans manipulating this landscape for things that they needed in ways that they needed. I was in a webinar a number of years ago where an Indigenous tribal leader from Ontario said he has long questioned the maps of black walnut because if you pay attention, they tend to, the native range maps tend to creep up the river corridors. And he was like, that's because we took them there. We use them all the time and we move the seeds around. So is that really native? Okay, so I've again, you got me on a soapbox and I launched. But I do think it's important to think about that and to remember that again, human stewards have been using Minnesota's landscapes since the last glacial retreat. And so you are just one of a line of many, many centuries of land stewards. And so to some degree, I think the power is in the fact that we can try to make really good ecological decisions and recognize that we are active stewards and recognize that's okay. And then I swear one last thing. I also just want to point out that settlement of Minnesota vastly changed our ecosystem. And so the tree compositions, the vegetative compositions that the earliest settlers found are not what we find today. And my favorite example of this is Pine County, Minnesota is almost entirely hardwoods now. That's because pines do not regenerate from stumps. And so when the logging companies came through and cut the pines, they were not actively looking for regeneration. They were not leaving seed trees so that those trees could regenerate. Hardwoods actively reproduce from stumps. So any hardwood, so think oaks that were present in those stands would have been removed. They would have been used for building, for firewood, for home use, but they would have grown back. At the same time, simultaneously with that introduction of white settlers, people were eating most everything. So in large areas of the state, deer were extirpated, they were eaten to local extinction, turkeys had to be reintroduced. So these things that we find to be common pests of our trees today were actually absent when many of our oak forests regenerated at settlements. And so the forests that we see and love today are not necessarily the forests that those first white settlers found, which were probably not the forests that preceded them 300 years before. So maybe hopeful. Our forests have been really resilient and continue to produce beautiful forests and ecosystems and the services that keep a thriving community of species together for many generations of upheaval. Okay, I will step off my soapbox.
Thanks, Angie. So we're not going to get to all the questions, but you see on the screen, I hope, our emails, Kira's email and Angie's email, and myself. You can certainly email your question there. I know there's one from Olmsted County on elderberry, Angie, that I'll let you address maybe later. And you probably know that person. Next question, real quickly. I have two more questions, then we'll probably close. The recommendation for black cherry in silvopasture setting, question mark, seems like most grazing operations try to remove black cherry. I think black cherry is like they want to establish tree. I suppose there's some black cherries that want to maybe be a shrub type, but I think these are the black cherries in southeastern Minnesota. Is that right, Angie? Would you say?
Oh gosh, I was reading the questions. So I do well. Could you reread the question to
Oh,
me?
it was a black cherry question on which what most people are removing black cherries out of the pastures instead of raising them.
Yeah, I
Growing
actually
them.
I did think that we had removed black cherry trees from the silvopasture list for that very reason. So it could be on the windbreak list. I would need to double check. But black cherries can be a
Oh,
problem in horse pastures in particular. So if we left it, there's probably an asterisk that defines that. And then it is important in our original primary list, there were both black. No, I'm sorry, I said black walnut, but I meant black cherry.
black cherry.
Black cherry trees and the more generic like cherry genera, which it does include understory and small cherries, and those get both were in the original lists.
Another question on dogwoods. We only list the gray dogwood, but red osier dogwood is commonly planted in windbreak settings in southwest and western Minnesota. Why did that not make the list? I'll just bring it up to the group here. Probably just not on the list that the methodology that we were looking at and the DNR list. Red osier did not show up as a warming climate. I would say. Okay.
Well,
Another
so
yeah.
I think we can address, I was wondering if any of our other co-authors looked that up. I actually do think it was included in that primary list.
Okay.
But it doesn't necessarily mean it made the agroforestry lists.
Sure. Okay. But you still plant it if you want. It's a very good shrub. It's grown a lot of places in Minnesota. Another one is I was told the hardy pecan does not produce nuts good enough for human consumption. Is that true? We don't know yet. I think the northern pecan is can produce, but our growing season, depending on where we're at in Minnesota, may not produce nuts that we can eat. So yeah, good question. Only time will tell. and then something about the QR codes, and certainly you can email some of our presenters for those QR codes and so forth. I think we're going to close it right here. And yeah, thank you, Angie and Kira, for presenting. Wonderful presentation today. So I'll close with a few slides here. All of our recordings are recorded on the Z-Link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. Thank you also for Anna and Lauren and Peter for putting in to chat the links and so forth. I will go on to the next slide here. So we go down to April 24th on our Fridays with a Forester, the Z-Link there to register. If you know people that want to register, z.umn.edu/Fridays 2026. And again, our recordings are on Z-Link as well. We are all booked up for our Minnesota Family Woodlands Conference, March 13th and 14th at Collegeville, Minnesota. However, there's a waiting list. And so if you want to put on the waiting list, you'll be first on the list for next year to get an email. But Anna's in charge of that. Thank you, Anna. And that's great that that's all sold out. When you close today's Zoom, you'll be asked to do a quick evaluation. Please do that. This is anonymous, and give your comments about today's webinar and then actually future webinars that you'd like to see on Fridays with a Forester. Here's some other links. If you're not getting our My Minnesota Woods monthly newsletter from our forestry team with the University of Minnesota Extension, there's a link there, and then a link to the Minnesota Family Woodland Conference as well. Again, all of our Fridays with a Forester, our recordings are recorded on a Z-Link at our YouTube page, z.umn.edu/Fridays. And thanks again for Kara and Anna for presenting today. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining us today on Fridays with a Forester.